Hello and welcome to this webinar on t-His curves. My name is Alistair Parks and I have about 10 years experience as an engineer using LS-DYNA and t-His on various automotive design projects as well as structural, seismic, geotechnical and offshore engineering projects across the world. In the last couple of years I've focused more on software development and now I'm managing our post-processing software D3Plot, t-His and Reporter. So this webinar is all about curves, how to manipulate them, filter them, and organize them. Hopefully by the end you'll have learned how to deal with lots of curves in one session and quickly home in on the results that matter to you. First we'll take a look at some of the tools to help you manipulate individual curves. So we'll look at Quick Pick, the Curve Manager, Right Click, and the Curve History, as well as Max Min properties. And then we'll move on to talking about how to deal with lots of curves. I'll show you auto blank, again we'll look at properties, how to overwrite input curves, searching and replacing curve labels, and finally the curve table, which is a great way of managing your session. So I'll open t-His and we'll get started. An important thing to be aware of when manipulating curves in t-His is that just like Primer and D3Plot, t-His has a quick pick menu, and by default it's set to blank. So that means if you click on a curve in a graph, then it will blank the curve. And if you drag a selection box, then it will blank all of the curves in the selection. Now, just like quick pick in Primer and D3Plot, you can middle click to undo the previous quick pick operation. And you can also use the keyboard shortcuts R to reverse the view and U to unblank all of the curves in the graph. I can change the quick pick action from the top menu. So here I could change it to line width control, and that would mean that all of the curves that I click on or select get a thicker line width. Sometimes if you have lots of different curves on the screen, it's difficult to pick the one you're interested in, and that's where some of the other tools come in handy, such as the Curve Manager here, where we can select a bunch of curves to blank them. Now when blanking with the Curve Manager, then the graph doesn't update automatically. You can achieve this either by clicking the Plot button down here, or just doing anything that would trigger a refresh of the graphics. So I can actually just hit the Control key and it will refresh. So the Quick Pick menu controls the clicking operation, but we can also right click on curves, and this is a really useful way of accessing all sorts of curve attributes. Here I can change the color of the curve or any of the other style options. And it's also in this menu that you can access the curve history. The curve history is a powerful tool which allows us to look at all of the operations that have been done in order to create the current curve that we're looking at. So I think we're looking at some sort of acceleration curve here, but I can check that. So if I right click on any of these buttons, then I can see that from the model we read the X acceleration, the Y acceleration, and the Z acceleration for one of the nodes. And then the next step was that we divided the acceleration values by 9,810. So that looks like we're converting the acceleration into G. And then from the automotive tools, we've applied an SAE class 180 filter to each of the acceleration components before combining the X, Y, and Z components to give us a vector magnitude acceleration. So if, for example, for this magnitude acceleration, I wanted to modify the filter that I'd used, then I can use the curve history panel to change one of the previous operations in the history. So I'll do that for each of the X, Y, and Z components. And then if I click Update Curve Independence, then t-His will go and update all of the relevant curve operations so that now my magnitude acceleration curve is using the C1000 filter. So one more thing I wanted to show you from the right-click menu is that you can look at the properties of an individual curve. So here we can see the minimum and max X and Y values. And if I want to add that to the graphical legend, I can just check one of these boxes here, and then the Y max value in this case is now shown on the graph. So now we've taken a quick look at some of the tools for manipulating individual curves, but things usually start to get more complicated when you've read lots of curves into your session, possibly from several different models. So that in the next part of this webinar, I'm going to show you some of the tools that will help you manage all of those curves and home in on the results that matter to you. So in this session, I've read 3 models into THIS, and I'm going to do an energy plot of all of the different energy components for all 3 models. So now I have lots of curves on the graph. In fact, I have so many that they won't all fit on the legend. I can increase the number of columns shown on the legend to increase the number of curves that I can see, but it will still not cover all 3 models. When you're dealing with this many curves at once, it's sometimes difficult to make sense of all of the data, and that's where AutoBlank can be really helpful. If you look at the graph title bar, you can see that AutoBlank is switched on. That's indicated by this AB. And so if I press Tab on my keyboard, then I can now cycle through all of the energy curves for each model, one model at a time. If I press Shift Tab, then it will cycle in the opposite direction. So this will cycle from model 3 back to model 2 and then back to model 1 again. This is a great way of doing a quick comparison of data between models, but you can also configure AutoBlank to cycle between various different things. So at the moment we're cycling through models, but we could also set the tab key to cycle through components. So now when I press tab, it will cycle through all of the different components that we have. So it's showing here, it's showing the time step for model 1, 2, and 3. And if we tab, then we'll get to kinetic energy comparison for the 3 models, tab again, and we see the internal energy, and so on. And again, this is a really useful way of sifting through your data and looking at the differences between different models. Now, in the previous part of the webinar, we used right-click to add the curve maximum to the graph, but that was just for an individual curve. You can also use the Properties tool in THIS to set those for all of the curves on your graph. So I can do Select All and then choose to highlight and show the maximum value for all of the curves in my session. Now, when I refresh the graphics, then I can see the maximum value for each curve. If I just want to view the maximum value over all of the curves in the graph, I can switch to the summary mode and select maximum value. So now I'm going to describe a couple more tips and tricks for dealing with lots of curves in your graph. So if I switch the AutoBlank back to models and we view all of the energy curves for model 2, then I can notice that the energy is currently being recorded in terms of millijoules. So here we've got 100, 150 times 10 to the 3, that's in millijoules. And supposing I now want to show all of the energy values in joules, then I would want to convert all of those curve values. So if I go to operate, then divide all of the visible curves on the page by 1000. Then if I clicked apply, that would convert the values from millijoules to joules. But if I do that, then the default output will be to create a new curve for every single one of those original energy curves. And if you've used THIS before, then you might find that as you do more and more operations, then you end up with more and more curves in your session, which becomes difficult to manage at times. So if you prefer, then you can switch the output to overwrite the input. So now when I click apply, then it will update all of the original curves with the operation. So now you can see on the y-axis, the 10 to the 3 has disappeared because all of these curves are now being shown in joules. As well as overwriting the input curves, THIS has updated the curve labels to indicate the division operation that I just did. But if I'm going to save this graph into a report, then I probably don't want the divide by 1000 on all of these energy component descriptions. So if I go back to the curve manager, then I'm faced with the prospect of going through each and every curve label description and removing the offending divide by 1000. Editing all the curve labels one by one would be a bit of a pain, but luckily there's a search and replace feature to make things easier. If I go to the style menu, then the search and replace feature is available. First, I'll select all of the curves and then enter the text that I want to search for. And finally, the replacement text. In this case, I just want to remove the 1000, so I'm going to leave the replace string empty. And then when I click go, then all of the legend labels are corrected. Also, if I go to the help, then I can read that you can use some special characters so that the replacement string is inserted either at the beginning or the end of the label. And that should help you update the labels of lots of curves all at the same time. One of the best ways to manage lots of curves in a THIS session is to use the curve table. The curve table can be found in the Curves Manager menu. Click the Table button to show the curve table. Here you can edit and filter the curves, view their properties, move the curves from one graph to another, and add annotations. I'll spend the next few minutes showing you some of the features, but I definitely recommend that you try out the curve table for yourself on your own models to see what it can do for you. So in the curve table, we have a list of all of the curves and the groups in your session. And the columns show the curve ID, the component, the directory and the model that the curve came from, any entity ID, the curve or group label, and the style information. You can use the View submenu to control which of these columns appear. So I can just deselect the ones that I'm not interested in at the moment. And that gives me some more space to focus on the data I care about. You can also reorder the columns by dragging the header to another location. On the right, we have two tabs, one with the graph buttons and the other for the curve properties, which we'll look at in a minute. To show you the graph buttons feature, it'll be easier if I create a few more graphs. So I'll go to the graphs menu and create some graphs. So for any of the curves in the list, you can tick the box in the graph column, and then if we refresh the plot, then that curve will appear in the corresponding graph. You can also click and then shift click lower down to select multiple curves at once. And we can also control the graphs via the groups. So THIS has automatically created a group of all the curves for each model. So I can move all of the Model 2 curves into Graph 2 and all of the Model 3 curves into Graph 3. And if I just undo the selections I made individually a second ago, then I should now have an energy plot for each model in Graphs 1, 2, and 3. So now I'd like to talk about filtering, but I think it'd be easier if I switch on the model file column first, so that you can see the model number for each of the curves. And if I scroll back up the list, then you'll be able to see that we're showing all the curves in this session. So we've got all of the curves for model 3, 2, and 1. And along the top of the curve table menu, we've got various filtering options. So we can filter by model. So if I only wanted to look at the curves for model 2, then I could just deselect model 1 and model 3. And now the list is only showing the curves for model 2. We're still looking at the groups. And of course, if I wanted to hide the groups, then I can go to the View submenu and show only curves. We can also filter by component. So for example, if I wasn't interested in time step, I could deselect that and it would disappear from the list. You can filter by type. So this would be relevant if you were looking at curves for nodes, shells. In this case, we've only got curves for the overall model because we're just looking at the global energy data. So that's less relevant here. But what we could do is filter by label. So this is quite a powerful tool that lets you filter by the curve label. So for example, I was interested in the eroded energy, then I could filter by eroded. By default, it's not a case sensitive filter. So if I untick ignore case, then it'll only show me the eroded with a lowercase e, but I'd like to look at all of the eroded energies. So we'll ignore case. And perhaps I wanted to compare the eroded energies with the total energy in the system. So then I can add another filter for total energy. And you can see that the logic for the filtering is to show curves that have eroded or TE in their label. If we switch the logic to and, then there aren't any curves with both of these filters. So once I've done my filtering, I could, for example, add those filtered curves into a new graph. So let's add them to graph 4. And it looks like the eroded energy is a very small fraction of the total energy in the model. To show you the eroded energy plots by themselves, I'll just deselect total energy from the graph buttons, as well as the energy ratio. And if we refresh the plot, then you can see those eroded energy plots by themselves. So now we've viewed and filtered the curves and we've moved them from one graph to another, but we can also access all of the curve properties from the curve table. This allows you to do a side-by-side comparison of some of the key attributes of your curves. And you can also use the Curve Properties tab to add annotations to your graphs. So for example, I could select the eroded energy curves, and if I right-click on the max Y column, then I can choose to annotate the max Y value on each of those curves in the graph. There are various annotation options. So for example, I could choose to show the X and Y values at those points, and I can also add a label to the annotation. Here the automatic annotation says max Y, so I'm going to change that to say max energy. And when we right click on the selected curves in general, then as well as doing annotations, then we can change the style of the selected curves, and we can also create groups or add curves to existing groups. So for example, I could create a group for these curves here. I'm going to call it model 2 eroded energies. And if I switch the view back on to include groups, then we can see my new group is included in the list. Using groups in the curve table is a really helpful way of managing a session with lots of data. So that's a quick rundown of some of the features of the curve table. As I say, do try it out for yourself, and if you have any questions, get in touch. So this webinar has been all about curves, and I hope that with these tools you'll be better equipped to manage all of your data and home in on the results that matter to you. But of course there are many more TS features that we haven't covered. There's lots of powerful stuff you can do with groups and graphs, and in terms of operations, then there's inbuilt operations for the automotive and seismic analysis, as well as things like fast Fourier transforms and other frequency domain post-processing. And as well as reading results data from your LS-DYNA model, you can also make THIS the hub for all of your data processing. You can read results from Nastran and OptiStruct, as well as diadem and ISO standard formatted test data. THIS also supports rapid automation. You can use FastTCF to record operations and replay them. In fact, we've got a whole webinar about FastTCF you can check out on our website. And the JavaScript API gives you access to all sorts of functions and gives you great flexibility with your automation workflow. THIS is now linked seamlessly with Reporter, so once you've automated your post-processing, you can also automate the creation of reports for each of your analysis simulations. If you're thinking about automating your workflow with THIS and the Oasys LS-DYNA suite, then please do get in touch. And now some quick announcements. The LS-DYNA conference for 2020 is next week. It will be the 16th International LS-DYNA conference, and it's moved from a physical event to a virtual event this year. It's taking place on the 10th and 11th of June, and it's a free online live event. You can register at LS-DYNAconference.com. We're expecting the full agenda to be published on the website within the next few days, but we know that it will feature Richard Sturt's keynote presentation, as well as various other papers from our team, including vehicle platoon aerodynamics using ICFD, weld residual stresses in LS-DYNA, our new shell version of the mobile offset progressive deformable barrier, and some new research on timber joints in LS-DYNA 2. To stay informed about all of the updates from the LS-DYNA community, subscribe to our newsletter at oasyssoftware.com/dyna/signup. And on our website, you can also watch recordings of past webinars and register for our upcoming webinars. That's the end of the webinar. I'll stay online now to answer any questions you might have. And for any other information, please contact us at the links on the screen. Thanks for watching.